Montana, the coldest night of winter. While the entire valley burned through piles of firewood just to stay alive, one woman lived quietly inside a mountain cave. Warm, fed, unbothered by the howling wind that tore across the Bitterroot Range like something angry and alive. Her name was Elara Jessup, though no one in town had called her by her first name in years. Most people simply called her Lark. A few called her the crazy woman in the cave. She never corrected either one. Lark was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with the kind of quiet strength that did not announce itself but never needed to. Her dark hair, streaked early with silver near the temples, was usually pulled back in a simple braid. Her face carried the calm stillness of someone who had learned long ago that silence was more useful than most conversations. She moved with purpose, every gesture deliberate, every step placed with the precision of a person trained to survive in places where mistakes were not forgiven. She had served in the United States Navy for nearly 15 years, not behind a desk, not in a support role. Lark had been one of the few women to complete some of the most demanding operational training the Navy offered. She had carried equipment through jungle heat and Arctic cold, had been deployed to regions most Americans would never hear about, and had returned home each time a little quieter than before. But the thing that finally broke her had nothing to do with war. It had everything to do with a little girl named Wren. Wherever Lark went now, a German shepherd followed close beside her. The dog's name was Boone. He was 3 years old with thick black and tan fur, sharp amber eyes, and the alert posture of a trained working dog. Boone rarely barked without reason. He moved with steady discipline as if he understood his role was to watch over both the cave and the woman who lived in it. His ears were always upright, scanning, listening. When Lark sat still, Boone sat still. When she moved, he moved. The bond between them was not affection alone. It was trust built through routine, through shared silence, through long winter nights when the only sounds were the drip of water on stone and the slow crackle of a single burning log. Boone had been a gift, the last gift Lark ever received from her father. But that story would come later. Inside the cave, the atmosphere felt unexpectedly alive compared to the frozen mountain air outside. The entrance was partially hidden behind a stand of tall ponderosa pines, their trunks dark against the snow. From the trail below, a person could walk past it 100 times and never notice it was there. But once inside, the space opened into something remarkable. Lark had spent nearly 2 years turning this natural cavern into a quiet underground farm. The cave was large enough for several distinct sections, each carefully arranged with practical purpose rather than decoration. There was no clutter, no wasted space. Everything had a reason for being exactly where it was. Along one wall of the cavern stretched several long wooden planting beds built from rough pine boards she had milled herself. Dark, rich soil filled each bed, and rows of lettuce, spinach, cabbage, kale, and herbs grew beneath soft yellow lamps that hung from iron hooks drilled into the stone ceiling. The glow of those lamps gave the entire section a warm golden hue, as though the plants were growing under a permanent sunset. Thin copper pipes ran from a natural spring deeper in the cave, carrying fresh water slowly into the soil through a gravity-fed drip system. The plants stayed green and healthy even in the dead of winter, even when the temperature outside dropped well below zero. Near the center of the cavern lay a shallow pond carved directly into the stone floor. The water inside was so clear, it reflected the lamps above like a second sky. Several silver trout swam lazily beneath the surface, their scales catching the light each time they turned. Occasionally, one would flick its tail and send small ripples across the pond, and for a moment the reflected light would dance against the cave walls, like something out of a dream. Each morning, Lark scattered a handful of feed across the water, while Boone sat nearby watching the fish move like quick shadows beneath the surface. He never lunged at them. He simply watched the way a soldier watches a perimeter. Behind the pond stood a compact greenhouse frame Lark had assembled, using salvaged glass windows and sturdy wooden beams. Inside the small structure, the air stayed slightly warmer than the rest of the cave. Tomato vines climbed thin cords tied to the overhead beams, and small pepper plants grew in neat clay pots arranged along simple wooden shelves. The smell inside the greenhouse was earthy and alive, a sharp contrast to the sterile cold of the mountain outside. But the most important part of the cave was built along the stone wall that curved toward the back of the cavern. A long earthen bench stretched across nearly the entire wall, made from packed clay, sand, and straw. It looked simple, almost primitive, but hidden inside that bench ran a series of clay pipes connected to a small fire chamber, no larger than a toolbox. When Lark placed a single log inside the chamber and lit it, the heat traveled slowly through the network of pipes beneath the bench, warming the entire mass of packed earth from within. The bench absorbed that warmth and released it gradually into the cave over many hours. The system was so efficient that Lark rarely needed more than 2 or 3 pieces of wood to keep the entire cavern comfortable through an entire evening. There was no roaring fire, no smoke filling the room, just a slow, steady warmth that rose from the earth itself, as natural and quiet as the woman who built it. From the outside, none of this was visible. All the townspeople ever saw was a woman who lived alone in a cave on the mountain, who rarely spoke, who almost never bought firewood, and who kept a dog that watched everyone with the same calm, unsettling focus. They had started calling the place the Strange Cave Farm. Some said Lark was clever. Others said she was simply odd. A few of the older men in town used harsher words. Most of them believed she had chosen a very unusual way to be alone, and they left it at that. What none of them knew was that the underground farm hidden inside that mountain had been built for a reason far deeper than comfort, far deeper than survival. And before the winter was over, the entire valley would learn why Lark Jessup had chosen to live beneath the stone. The next afternoon, thin clouds drifted across a pale winter sky as a steady wind pushed light trails of snow along the main street of the small valley town. It was the kind of ordinary cold day people barely noticed anymore. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few trucks idled near the feed store. Life moved at the slow, familiar pace it always did during the long Montana winter. Lark walked down the street with Boone moving calmly beside her, the dog's paws leaving neat prints in the thin layer of fresh snow. She came to town only every few weeks, and only when she needed supplies the cave could not provide. A small canvas bag hung over her shoulder. Inside it was a short list written in her careful hand. Vegetable seeds, a box of screws, a replacement lantern wick, nothing more. Boone stayed close to her leg, his thick coat brushing lightly against her worn boots. His ears stayed upright, scanning the quiet street with the steady attention of a dog that had been trained to notice everything and react to nothing unless given reason. The general store stood near the center of town, a wide wooden building with a faded green door and windows fogged by the warmth inside. Lark pushed the door open and stepped in, bringing a gust of cold air with her. The smell of coffee, wood smoke, and old timber filled the room immediately. Near the cast-iron stove in the center of the store sat 3 men who spent most of their afternoons doing exactly what they were doing now: talking, laughing, passing the slow winter hours with stories that grew a little taller each time they were told. The first to notice Lark was Hank Dawson. He was a broad-shouldered cattle rancher in his mid-50s with a thick gray mustache and skin darkened and roughened by decades of working livestock under open sky. Hank was known in town for his loud voice and even louder laugh. Most people agreed he meant no real harm, though his humor often landed harder than he intended. When he saw Lark step through the door, Hank leaned back in his chair with a wide grin spreading beneath that gray mustache. "Well, now look who came down from the mountain, the queen of the cave herself." The second man turned to look. His name was Vince Cooley, a tall, bony mechanic in his early 40s with thin, sandy hair and a narrow face that seemed permanently set in mild disapproval. Vince had once owned a small engine repair business on the edge of town, but a string of bad decisions and one particularly harsh winter had wiped him out several years back. The failure had left a bitter residue on nearly everything he said, and he had developed the habit of mocking other people's choices whenever he could not understand them. "So the stories are true then?" Vince said, chuckling softly. You really got vegetables growing under a rock up there. The third man was younger. Ridley Munn, barely 25, worked part-time at the lumber yard on the north end of town. He had freckled skin, a shy disposition, and the unfortunate tendency of laughing at whatever the older men laughed at, whether he found it funny or not. Ridley let out an awkward laugh, now simply because Hank and Vince were smiling. I heard she has fish swimming in a cave pond, too. Vince continued, his voice carrying easily across the warm store. Next thing you know, she will be milking mountain goats down there. The laughter rolled through the room, bouncing off the wooden walls and the glass jars lined neatly on the shelves. Lark said nothing. She walked to the counter where the store owner stood, sorting small boxes of nails. The woman behind the counter was Dorothy Pemberton, though everyone in town called her Dot. She was in her early 60s with short silver hair and kind, observant eyes that had watched this valley change for decades. Dot was a practical woman with a calm temperament. She never laughed when Lark came in. She never asked questions that were not her business, and she always had whatever Lark needed ready and waiting. Dot handed over a small paper bag containing the seed packets Lark had ordered earlier that week. "Good to see you, Lark. Tomato seeds finally came in." Lark nodded once in thanks and placed a few folded bills on the counter. Boone sat patiently beside her, his tail resting neatly against the wooden floor. His eyes steady and calm despite the laughter still floating from the direction of the stove. As Lark turned to leave, something shifted. Her heavy coat moved slightly, and Dot noticed it. Partially tucked inside the inner pocket was a worn photograph, its edges softened from age and handling. For just a moment the picture tilted outward, and Dot caught a glimpse of the image. A young girl about 8 years old with bright eyes and a wide, joyful smile, sunlight in her hair, laughter frozen in time on her small face. Dot said nothing, but she watched silently as Lark stepped back into the cold with Boone at her side and disappeared into the pale afternoon light. That evening, the cave was quiet. Lark had finished feeding the trout and checking the water flow through the copper pipes. The lamps hummed softly above the planting beds. Boone lay near the entrance, his head resting on his front paws, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of wind brushing against the rocks outside. Lark walked to the wooden shelf carved into the rock wall near the back of the cavern. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully removed the photograph, placing it in its usual spot between a small tin lantern and a folded bandana that had once belonged to her father. The picture showed a girl standing in a grassy meadow. Wildflowers scattered around her feet, the mountains rising soft and blue behind her. The girl's name was Wren. She had been 8 years old when that photograph was taken. She had been 8 years old when she died. Beside the photograph of Wren stood another picture in a simple wooden frame. This one showed a man in his late 60s with deep-set eyes, a square jaw softened by age, and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he had spent his life working. His name was Colton Jessup. Everyone had called him Colt. He had been Lark's father, and he had been dead now for 3 years. Lark sat down on the warm earthen bench and stared at both photographs. Boone padded over and lay down beside her boots, pressing his warm body against her legs, the way he always did when the cave grew too quiet and the silence became something heavier than sound. Colt Jessup had never served in any military. He had never traveled farther than 2 states from Montana in his entire life. But he had known more about surviving in these mountains than most men could learn in 3 lifetimes. He had been a timber worker, a trapper, a hunter, and above all a man who believed that the land would take care of you if you had the patience to learn its language. Colt had taught Lark everything: how to find water in dry rock, how to read the sky for weather 3 days out, how to build a fire that lasted all night from a single log, how to construct a heating bench from nothing more than clay, sand, straw, and a few lengths of pipe. He had taught her with patience and repetition, the same way the mountains taught everyone who lived among them, slowly and without mercy for those who refused to listen. One evening years ago, when Lark was still a teenager, Sitting beside him on a hand-built bench, much like the one she sat on now, Colt had said something she never forgot. You build a shelter not for yourself, Lark. You build it for the person who does not know yet that they are going to need it. She had carried those words through boot camp, through deployments, through long nights in places she could never talk about. And when everything fell apart, when the worst thing that could ever happen to a mother finally happened to her, those words were the only thing she had left to hold on to. 5 years ago, on a night very much like this one, Lark had been deployed on a search and rescue operation in the northern Montana wilderness. A group of hikers had gone missing near Glacier, and Lark's team had been called in because the terrain was too dangerous for standard rescue crews. She had been gone for 4 days. Wren was home. She was supposed to be safe. The storm came faster than anyone predicted. It swept down from Canada like a white wall, dropping temperatures 20 degrees in less than 2 hours. The woman watching Wren had fallen asleep on the couch. And Wren, 8 years old, with her mother's stubborn courage and her grandfather's restless need to move, had pulled on her boots and walked out the front door into the snow. She had been looking for her mother. Lark and Wren had lived in a small rented cabin near Glacier, at the time more than 100 miles north of this valley. It was a remote posting far from any town where people would remember their faces. The local volunteer rescue team was mobilized, but the storm made everything slow. A young cattle rancher named Beckett Langford, barely 30 at the time, and living near the search area on a seasonal grazing lease, had joined the effort. Beckett had pushed through drifts that reached his chest. He had called Wren's name until his voice cracked and gave out. He had searched for nearly 6 hours through the worst of the storm. He found her just before dawn. She was curled beneath a fallen pine tree less than half a mile from the house. Her small body was still. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were closed, and the snow had already begun to gather in the folds of her jacket, as though the mountain were trying to pull her gently into itself. Beckett had carried her back, but it was too late. When Lark returned from the rescue mission 2 days later, her daughter was already gone. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She stood in the doorway of her own home and looked at the empty bed where Wren had slept, and something inside her went quiet in a way that never fully came back. Lark left the area after that. She never returned to the cabin near Glacier. She spent months alone in the mountains farther south, moving from shelter to shelter, barely eating, barely sleeping. Boone was not with her yet. There was no dog, no cave, no farm. There was only the cold and the silence and the unbearable weight of knowing that she had been out saving strangers while her own daughter died alone in the snow. It was during that time, somewhere between grief and survival, that Lark began to build, not for herself, for the next child who might get lost on this mountain, for the next mother who might not make it home in time, for anyone caught in the cold who needed a place where the warmth would hold through the night. She found the cave on a gray afternoon in early spring, 2 years after Wren's death, and a few months after Colt himself had passed. Her father had died quietly in his sleep, the way men like him often did. No hospital, no fuss. Just a long exhale one cold morning, and then stillness. Before he died, Colt had given Lark one last gift. A German shepherd puppy with amber eyes and oversized paws. Colt had picked the dog himself from a ranch east of Missoula. He will be steady. Colt had said, his voice thin but certain, name him Boone, he will know what to do. And Colt had been right. Boone grew into exactly the dog his name suggested. Calm, alert, unshakable. He followed Lark into the cave and never once looked back toward the world below. Now sitting on the warm bench with Boone pressed against her legs and the photographs of Wren and Colt watching from the shelf, Lark listened to the wind outside begin to change. It had picked up over the past hour, shifting from the usual steady push to something deeper and more unsettled. The pine trees near the cave entrance creaked and groaned as the gusts grew stronger. Lark stood and walked to the entrance. She looked out across the valley below. The sky to the north had turned a shade of gray she recognized immediately. Not the pale gray of an ordinary winter day. This was darker. heavier, the kind of sky that pressed down on the land like a hand closing slowly into a fist. She had seen skies like that before. The night Wren died, the sky had looked exactly the same. Lark turned back into the cave. She moved with quiet urgency, now checking the water lines, adding extra feed to the trout pond, stacking firewood near the heating chamber. She pulled dried vegetables from storage and arranged them on a clean shelf near the bench. She filled 2 extra water containers from the spring and placed them near the greenhouse. She was preparing for more than herself. She could not explain exactly why. It was instinct. The same instinct her father had taught her to trust. The same instinct the Navy had sharpened into something she could not ignore, even when she wanted to. Boone watched her move through the cave, his amber eyes tracking every step. He did not seem anxious, but his ears had not relaxed in over an hour, and twice he had walked to the cave entrance and stood there staring into the darkening sky before returning to Lark's side. When she finally sat down again, the cave was ready. The lamps glowed. The bench radiated its slow, deep warmth. The plants stood green and alive beneath their golden light. The trout circled the pond in their endless patient loops. Lark looked at the photographs on the shelf one more time. "This time I am ready," she said quietly. Boone pressed his nose against her hand. Outside, the first flakes of what would become the worst blizzard in 20 years began to fall across the Bitterroot Valley. The town below had no idea what was coming, but Lark Jessup did, and so did her dog. The blizzard hit the valley like a freight train made of ice and silence. By midnight, the roads had vanished. Fences disappeared beneath drifts that climbed 4 and 5 feet high, in places swallowing fence posts and mailboxes, and the lower branches of trees that had stood along those roads for decades. The wind did not simply blow. It screamed. It drove the snow sideways in sheets so thick that a person standing on their own porch could not see the barn 30 feet away. Power lines went down before dawn. The town lost electricity in stages, block by block, until the entire valley sat in cold darkness. The only light came from windows where families huddled around wood stoves and fireplaces, feeding whatever they had left into the flames. Some burned split oak, some burned pine. A few families near the edge of town had already started breaking apart old furniture because their wood piles had been low before the storm even began. Up on the mountain inside the cave, the world was different. The lamps glowed steady and warm. The trout circled their pond in slow, lazy patterns. The plants in the wooden bed stood tall beneath their golden light. And the earthen bench along the back wall radiated the same deep, patient heat it had been releasing all evening. Lark had placed a fresh log in the fire chamber 2 hours earlier, and the warmth now moved through the clay pipes beneath the bench, like a slow heartbeat, filling the cave with a comfort that felt almost impossible given what raged outside. Lark sat on the bench with a tin cup of hot water and honey, listening to the storm. She had heard storms before, many of them, but this one had a different quality, a deeper pitch, a longer breath between gusts, as though the wind were gathering itself each time before striking harder than the last. Boone lay near the cave entrance, his body relaxed but his ears fully upright. He had not slept. His amber eyes stared into the wall of white beyond the entrance, and every few minutes his nose twitched as he processed some invisible piece of information carried on the frozen air. Then, just past 1 in the morning, Boone stood up. It was not a gradual movement. The dog rose to his feet in a single motion, his entire body rigid. His head tilted slightly to the left. His ears rotated forward like 2 small radar dishes locking onto a signal. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, and then a low sound came from deep in his throat. Not a bark, not a growl. Something between the two, something that Lark had only heard a handful of times in the 3 years she had owned him. It was the sound Boone made when something was wrong. Lark set down her cup and stood. She watched the dog carefully. Boone took 2 steps toward the entrance, stopped, looked back at her, then took 2 more steps. His tail was low, but not tucked. His body leaned forward into the wind. Every muscle in his frame said the same thing. Someone is out there. Lark pulled on her heavy winter coat, zipped it to her chin, and tugged a wool hat down over her ears. She grabbed a flashlight from the shelf near the entrance, though she knew it would be nearly useless in this kind of whiteout. Boone did not wait for a command. The moment Lark moved toward the entrance, the dog launched himself into the storm and disappeared into the swirling white wall within seconds. The cold hit Lark like a physical blow. The wind tore at her coat and drove ice crystals into her face, so hard they felt like tiny needles. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The mountain trail that led down to the valley was completely gone, buried under fresh snow that shifted and reformed with every gust. Lark pushed forward, following the sound of Boone's movement ahead of her, the muffled thud of his paws breaking through the crust of ice that had formed over the deeper drifts. She found him about 50 yards from the cave entrance. Boone was standing beneath the wide branches of a snow-covered pine tree, his body positioned between the trunk and the open mountainside as though he were shielding something from the wind. His tail moved once when he saw Lark approaching, but he did not leave his position. He stood firm, his thick fur coated in white, his eyes locked on a small shape huddled against the base of the tree. It was a child, a boy, small and thin, curled into himself with his arms wrapped around his knees and his face buried against his chest. He wore a light jacket, the kind meant for a cool autumn afternoon, not a killing blizzard. His hands were bare. His sneakers were soaked through. His light brown hair was clumped with melting snow, and even in the dim glow of the flashlight, Lark could see that his lips had turned a pale shade of blue. She knelt beside him immediately. The boy looked up. His eyes were wide and glassy, the dull, unfocused look of a child whose body had begun shutting down to preserve whatever warmth it had left. Small freckles dotted his nose and cheeks, barely visible beneath the flush of cold on his skin. "I got lost," he whispered. His voice was so thin the wind nearly carried it away. Lark did not ask more questions. She unzipped her coat, pulled the boy against her body, and wrapped the heavy fabric around both of them. His small frame felt frighteningly cold against her chest, and she could feel the trembling in his muscles, the kind of deep involuntary shaking that meant his core temperature had dropped dangerously low. She lifted him. He weighed almost nothing. Boone stayed close beside them as they pushed back through the deepening snow toward the cave. The dog moved slightly ahead, breaking a narrow path through the drifts, looking back every few steps to make sure Lark was still following. The 50 yards back to the cave entrance felt like a mile. The wind fought them the entire way, shoving against Lark's back and sides as though trying to push them off the mountain entirely. But Lark had carried heavier loads through worse conditions in places far more dangerous than this. She held the boy tight against her chest and kept moving one steady step at a time until the dark shape of the cave entrance appeared through the white curtain of snow. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately. Lark carried the boy directly to the earthen bench and set him down gently on the warm clay surface. The heat from the pipes beneath rose slowly into his small body. She pulled a thick wool blanket from the wooden chest near the wall and wrapped it tightly around his shoulders, then poured hot water into a metal cup and stirred in a spoonful of honey. The boy's hands trembled so badly he could barely hold the cup. Lark steadied it for him, guiding it to his lips, letting him drink slowly. Boone padded over without being called and lay down directly beside the boy, pressing his warm body firmly against the child's legs. The dog's thick fur radiated a steady living heat, and within minutes the boy's breathing began to slow. The terrible shaking in his shoulders gradually softened. Color crept back into his cheeks, faint at first, then stronger. The cave lights glowed above them, reflecting gently across the surface of the pond and the glass panels of the greenhouse. Outside, the storm roared against the mountain walls with a fury that shook loose snow from the rocks above the entrance. But inside, the air remained calm and still and warm. After several minutes, the boy's eyes began to move. They traveled slowly around the cave, taking in the rows of green plants under the golden lamps, the clear pond with its silver fish, the small greenhouse with its climbing tomato vines. His expression shifted from exhaustion to something closer to wonder. "Is this your house?" he asked weakly. Lark gave a small nod. The boy hesitated. His tired eyes drifted across the cavern once more, then settled back on Lark's face. Can I stay here for a little while? Lark said nothing at first. She simply pulled the blanket tighter around his thin shoulders. Then she nodded once. His name, she would learn shortly after, was Cody Langford. He was 7 years old. He had followed a neighbor's dog out the back door of his family's ranch house just before the storm reached its peak, chasing the animal across the lower pasture and into the tree line before realizing he had gone too far. By then, the snow had erased every familiar landmark. The fences were gone. The house was gone. There was nothing but white in every direction, and the wind was so loud he could not even hear himself calling for help. He had wandered uphill without knowing it, stumbling through drifts that reached past his waist until his legs gave out beneath the pine tree where Boone found him. Lark recognized the last name immediately. The Langford family lived on a small cattle ranch at the southern edge of town. Cody's father was Beckett Langford, tall, hard-working, late 30s. A man known around the valley for his quiet determination and the weary patience of someone who had rebuilt his operation after losing half his herd during a brutal winter several years back. Beckett Langford had moved to this valley only 2 years ago, relocating from the northern part of the state to start fresh after a string of difficult seasons. He had no idea that the woman living in the cave above his new town was the same woman whose daughter he had carried out of a blizzard 5 years earlier, 100 miles north of here. They had never met face to face. On that terrible night near Glacier, Beckett had handed Wren's body to the paramedics and driven home in silence. He never learned the mother's name. He only remembered the child's face, and it had followed him into his sleep every winter since. Lark knew who he was. She had read every name on the volunteer rescue report, memorized every detail, traced every person involved in the search. When she moved to this valley and learned that a man named Beckett Langford had settled on a ranch at the edge of town, she understood immediately. But she never approached him. She never spoke his name. She simply avoided the south end of town and kept her distance the way a person keeps distance from a wound that has closed but never fully healed. Now his son sat on her bench, wrapped in her blanket, warmed by her dog. Lark sat beside Cody and watched him drink the warm honey water in small, careful sips. Boone had not moved from the boy's side. The dog's head rested on his front paws, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and steady. The warmth from the bench and the warmth from the dog worked together, pulling the boy slowly back from the edge of something that could have ended very differently. Then Cody's eyes found the shelf, the wooden shelf carved into the rock wall near the back of the cavern. The shelf where two photographs sat side by side in the soft lamplight. One showed a man with deep-set eyes and weathered hands. The other showed a girl standing in a meadow full of wild flowers, sunlight in her hair, laughter frozen on her small face. "Who is she?" Cody asked. The question was innocent. A child's question asked the way children ask things without weight or agenda, simply because they want to know. Lark looked at the photograph for a long time before answering. "My daughter." Cody studied the picture with the quiet seriousness that children sometimes show when they sense something important without fully understanding what it is. Then he turned back to Lark. "Where is she?" The cave fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause for a moment, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. Lark did not answer. She could not. The words were somewhere inside her, locked behind the same door she had sealed shut 5 years ago. The door she had reinforced with discipline and routine, and the endless quiet work of building something useful from the wreckage of everything she had lost. Then Cody said something that no amount of training, no amount of military discipline, no amount of silence could have prepared her for. "I got lost too," he said softly, looking down at Boone's warm fur beneath his small hand. "But your dog found me." He paused. "Maybe your dog wanted to find your daughter too." Lark's hands went still in her lap. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes stayed on the photograph of Wren. The bright smile, the wildflowers, the sunlight that would never move again. And for the first time in 5 years, for the first time since she had stood in the doorway of her own home and looked at an empty bed, something cracked open inside her chest. She did not sob. She did not make a sound. But a single tear slid down her cheek and dropped onto the wool blanket wrapped around the boy beside her. Then another. Then another. Boone lifted his head and pressed his nose gently against Lark's hand. Cody did not say anything more. He simply leaned against her arm the way a child leans against a parent when the world feels too large and too cold, and closed his eyes. Outside, the storm raged on. Snow piled higher against the cave entrance. The wind howled across the ridgeline like something searching for a way in. But inside the cave, the lamps glowed soft and golden. The trout circled their quiet pond. The plants stood green and patient beneath their lights. And on the warm earthen bench, a woman who had lost everything sat beside a boy who had almost been lost himself, while a dog named Boone kept watch over both of them, steady and still, as though this was exactly what he had been trained to do all along. The next morning, the storm had not fully passed, but the wind had softened enough for movement. A pale gray light filtered across the valley and through the lingering snowfall. The shapes of rooftops and fence lines began to reappear like the bones of a buried world slowly rising back to the surface. In town, worried voices filled the cold morning air. Neighbors moved through the snow in heavy coats and boots, calling out to one another, checking on the elderly, counting children. The news that Cody Langford had not come home the night before had spread quickly past from house to house, the way all urgent news traveled in small towns through phone calls and shouts across driveways, and the heavy knock of a gloved fist on a neighbor's front door. Beckett Langford was already on the mountain road. He rode slowly on horseback through snow that reached the animal's chest, in places his dark beard grown uneven from a sleepless night. His eyes raw and red from the cold and from something deeper than cold. Beside him rode Gus Harmon, a broad man in his early 50s with a weathered face and thick gray sideburns. Gus had lived in the valley most of his life and was known for helping anyone in trouble, though his blunt voice often made him sound harsher than he truly was. Dorothy Pemberton had insisted on joining the search. She rode a borrowed horse wrapped in a thick brown coat and wool scarf, her 60-year-old frame steady in the saddle despite the bitter air. Her calm eyes scanned the snowy hillside with the patience of a woman who had spent decades watching this valley and the people in it. It was Dot who noticed the tracks first. "Look," she said quietly, pointing toward a narrow trail climbing the slope ahead. The snow showed the clear marks of a large dog's paws beside the uneven footprints of a person heading uphill. Gus squinted toward the mountain. "That dog looks like Lark's shepherd." Beckett said nothing. He nudged his horse forward and followed the trail. The path led them higher past the tree line until the rocky face of the mountain appeared through the drifting snow. There, half hidden behind a stand of ponderosa pines, the entrance of the cave came into view. Warm air drifted from inside like breath from a sleeping giant. Beckett dismounted and moved toward the opening before anyone else had stopped their horse. Megan Langford was close behind. She had ridden up the mountain on a second horse with Dot, her long chestnut hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, her face pale and drawn from a night of fear that no mother should ever have to endure. When the group stepped inside the cave, they stopped. The sight before them was nothing like what they expected. Instead of a cold, dark hole in the rock, the cave glowed with warm, golden light. Rows of green plants filled wooden beds along the walls. A clear pond reflected the lamps above. The air smelled of soil and fresh herbs rather than damp stone. And there, near the earthen bench along the back wall, sat Cody. He was wrapped in a thick wool blanket. His cheeks were pink. His eyes were bright. Boone lay beside him, the dog's tail resting quietly on the ground as he watched the visitors enter with calm, steady eyes. The moment Cody saw his parents, he jumped to his feet and ran forward. "Mom!" Megan dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around her son so tightly it seemed she might never let go. A sound came from her that was not quite a word, not quite a cry, but something between the two that only a mother who has spent a night believing the worst could ever make. "I thought we lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking apart on the last word. Beckett stood beside them, one large hand resting on Cody's shoulder. The hard lines of his face softened, his jaw unclenched. His eyes, which had held nothing but fear for the past 12 hours, finally closed for a moment, as relief moved through him like warm water through frozen pipes. "She found me," Cody said, pointing toward the back of the cave. "The lady on the mountain and her dog." Lark stood quietly near the pond, her arms folded loosely, watching the reunion from a distance. Boone had risen and walked back to her side, sitting calmly at her left heel, the way he always did. For several minutes, no one spoke. The group looked around the cave in silence, their eyes moving from the planting beds to the greenhouse, to the trout pond, to the long warm bench that radiated heat into the cavern like a living thing. Gus slowly shook his head. "You built all this inside a mountain." Lark gave a small nod but said nothing more. Then Beckett's eyes drifted to the shelf. The wooden shelf near the back wall, the two photographs sitting side by side in the lamplight. He stepped closer. His gaze settled on the picture of the girl, the meadow, the wildflowers, the smile, and something shifted behind his eyes. He stared at the photograph for a long time. His breathing changed. His hand still resting on Cody's shoulder tightened slightly. When he finally turned to look at Lark, his face carried an expression that had nothing to do with gratitude for his son's rescue. It was older than that, deeper. It was the look of a man who has just been struck by a memory he has spent years trying to outrun. "That girl," Beckett said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that face." Lark met his eyes. She did not look away. "Her name was Wren," Lark said quietly. "She was my daughter." The cave went completely still. Even Boone seemed to hold his breath. Beckett's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes moved from the photograph to Lark and back again, and in that small space of time, 5 years, collapsed into a single moment. He was no longer standing in a warm cave. He was back in the storm, 28 years old, snow to his chest, screaming a little girl's name into a wind that swallowed every sound, finding her beneath a fallen pine, carrying her back, knowing already from the weight of her, from the stillness of her, that he was carrying something the world would never give back. "I was on the rescue team that night," Beckett said. His voice cracked on the word night. "I found her. I carried her out." He paused. His throat moved. "I was 20 minutes too late." No one in the cave moved. Megan looked up from where she knelt with Cody, her arm still around the boy. Dot pressed a hand to her mouth. Gus stared at the ground. Beckett took a step toward Lark. His eyes were wet now, and the big man who had spent his entire adult life holding everything inside suddenly looked as fragile as the boy he had come to rescue. "I have thought about that night every winter since," he said. "Every time the snow comes, I see her face. I am sorry. I am so sorry I did not get there in time." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the cave, heavier than the stone, heavier than the storm outside. It pressed down on everyone in the room and held them in place. Lark looked at Beckett for a long moment. Then her eyes moved to Cody standing between his parents, his small hand gripping his father's coat, alive and warm and breathing. "You came in time for him," Lark said. Her voice was steady, but something trembled beneath it like a wire pulled tight. "That is enough." Beckett exhaled. It was not a breath. It was a release. 5 years of guilt leaving his body in a single broken sound. Outside, the storm continued to push snow against the mountainside. But inside the cave, something had shifted. Something that had been locked in place for half a decade had finally quietly come undone. The storm did not leave. For 3 more days it sat over the valley like something with weight and intention, pressing the sky low against the mountains, filling the air with a constant suffocating white. The roads stayed buried. Supply trucks that were supposed to arrive from Missoula never came. Phone lines crackled and went dead. The valley was sealed shut, and the people inside it were running out of everything that kept them alive. Firewood was the first thing to go. Most families in town kept enough split wood to last through a normal Montana winter. But this was not a normal winter. This storm had already burned through 4 days of fuel in the first 2 nights alone, because the cold was so deep and so relentless that stoves had to run all day and all night just to keep the pipes from freezing. By the third morning, families on the west side of town were feeding their last logs into fireplaces that could not hold the heat long enough to matter. By afternoon, 3 households had run completely dry. Then the water stopped. The cold cracked the main supply line that fed the eastern half of town. Water pressure dropped to nothing in dozens of homes overnight. People melted snow on their stoves for drinking water. But that required fire, and fire required wood, and the wood was almost gone. The general store still had some canned goods on its shelves, but Dot Pemberton knew the math better than anyone. She had been counting inventory quietly for 2 days, and the numbers did not lie. At the current rate, the store would be empty within a week. If the storm held any longer than that, the situation would move from difficult to dangerous. The first person to speak the truth out loud was Beckett Langford. He stood in the center of the general store on the morning of the 4th day, surrounded by a small crowd of townspeople who had gathered near the iron stove simply because it was the only warm place left in the building. Beckett's tall frame looked thinner than it had a week ago. His dark beard had grown uneven. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. But when he spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that made people stop and listen. "We all saw it," Beckett said. "Lark's Cave is warm. She has food growing up there, clean water. My boy would not be standing here today if it were not for that place and that woman." The room shifted. People looked at each other. A few looked at the floor. Near the door stood Hank Dawson, the big cattle rancher, who had once laughed the loudest at the mention of Lark's name. Hank's thick gray mustache twitched slightly, the way it always did when he was uncomfortable. The usual humor in his broad face had been replaced by something quieter, something that looked for the first time anyone could remember like shame. "I suppose it is time we admit that woman might know a thing or two," Hank muttered. He rubbed the back of his neck with one heavy hand and stared at the stove rather than meet anyone's eyes. Beside him stood Vince Cooley. The thin mechanic with the narrow face and the skeptical eyes said nothing for a long time. The storm had frozen the pipes in his garage on the 2nd day. His workshop was unusable. His house was barely warmer than the street outside. Vince was not a man who admitted he was wrong about anything. But the cold had a way of stripping the stubbornness out of a person, the way wind stripped bark from a dead tree. "Guess we should ask her," Vince said finally. The words came out flat and reluctant, but they came out. By late afternoon, a small group of townspeople made their way up the mountain trail. The wind had softened just enough to allow passage, but the snow remained deep and heavy, and every step was a negotiation with the drifts that tried to hold them back. Beckett led the way. Gus Harmon walked beside him. Behind them came Hank Vince Ridley Munn and half a dozen others, some carrying blankets, some carrying tools, all of them carrying the quiet weight of people who had spent days pretending they did not need help and could not pretend any longer. When they reached the cave entrance, warm air drifted outward to meet them. That same gentle current of heat that had greeted the search party days earlier, steady and alive like breath from something ancient and patient hidden inside the rock. Lark appeared at the entrance. Boone stood beside her, his thick fur dusted with fine snow, his amber eyes calm and watchful as he studied the group. Neither Lark nor the dog seemed surprised. It was as though they had been expecting this. Perhaps they had. Beckett stepped forward. He removed his hat not out of formality, but out of something closer to respect. Lark, some folks in town are running out of firewood. Water lines are cracked. Food is getting thin. He paused. We could use some help. Lark looked past him down toward the valley where the rooftops of the small town were barely visible through the lingering snowfall. White smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin and fading. Most of the others had gone dark. You can come inside, she said. The first families who entered the cave stopped just past the entrance and did not move for a long time. The warm air wrapped around them, instantly melting the frost from coats and scarves and eyelashes. Children stared wide-eyed at the rows of green vegetables growing beneath golden lamps at the clear pond where silver trout moved through water that reflected the light above like a mirror laid flat on the earth. A woman near the back of the group pressed her hand against the warm surface of the earthen bench and held it there, her eyes closing slowly as the heat traveled through her frozen fingers and into her bones. One of the first to speak was Ruth Calloway, the town's school teacher. Ruth was in her late 40s with pale skin and tired blue eyes that carried the particular kind of weariness that belongs to people who have spent their lives caring for others with very little left over for themselves. Her husband had been killed in a logging accident years earlier, and she had raised her young daughter alone ever since, teaching every child in the valley, while barely keeping her own household together. Ruth stepped inside the cave slowly, her gaze moving across the planting beds, the greenhouse, the pond, the bench. You built all this yourself? She asked quietly. Lark nodded once. Ruth said nothing more. But she stood in the center of that warm cave and looked at Lark with an expression that held something far deeper than surprise. It held recognition. One woman who had carried everything alone, looking at another who had done the same. Over the next several hours, more townspeople arrived. The cave grew busier than it had ever been, filled with the sounds of boots on stone, low voices, children whispering to each other as they pointed at the fish in the pond and the tomatoes climbing their cords in the greenhouse. But despite the crowd, the cave remained warm. The earthen bench held its heat. The lamps glowed steady. The underground farm that one woman and one dog had built in silence over 2 years now held an entire community inside its walls. Hank Dawson eventually made his way across the cave to where Lark stood near the pond. The big rancher moved slowly as though each step cost him something. When he reached her, he cleared his throat the way men do when they are about to say something they have never practiced. Lark, I reckon I owe you an apology, Hank said. His voice was quieter than anyone in town had ever heard it. I laughed. I should not have. Turns out that cave of yours might be the smartest thing in this whole valley. Lark looked at him for a moment. She did not smile. She did not wave it away. She simply nodded once, the way she acknowledged most things, and turned back to the work of feeding people. Vince Cooley never apologized with words. That was not his way, and perhaps it never would be. But sometime during the second evening, Lark noticed that the drip system feeding her planting beds had developed a small leak near one of the copper joints. Before she could reach for her tools, Vince was already there. He knelt beside the pipe with a wrench he had carried up the mountain in his coat pocket, his thin hands moving with the precise practiced skill of a man who understood machines the way some people understood music. He fixed the joint in under 5 minutes, tightened 2 other connections he noticed along the way, and stood up without saying a word. He did not look at Lark. He did not need to. The work said everything his mouth could not. Ridley Munn, the young lumber worker, who had always laughed because the older men laughed, did something no one expected. On the 3rd morning inside the cave, when the woodpile near the fire chamber had grown thin, Ridley volunteered to hike down the mountain and haul back timber. No one asked him to. No one suggested it. He simply pulled on his coat, picked up an axe, and walked out into the cold. He returned 4 hours later, half frozen and breathing hard, dragging a sled loaded with enough split pine to last 3 more days. When Hank tried to thank him, Ridley just shrugged and said it needed doing. It was the first time anyone in town had seen Ridley Munn make a decision entirely on his own. Inside the cave, something began to happen that had nothing to do with survival. It had to do with connection. Ruth Calloway gathered the children near the greenhouse and began teaching them about the plants, explaining how seeds became food and how light could replace the sun if you understood how to use it. The children listened with wide eyes, their small fingers touching the tomato leaves as though they were something magical. Hank helped Beckett reinforce a section of the cave wall. Where the rock had begun to crumble, the two men working side by side in a silence that felt more like friendship than anything either of them had experienced in years. Dot Pemberton organized the food distribution with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been running a store for decades and understood that fairness mattered more than speed. And through it all, Lark worked. She checked the water lines, she fed the fish, she monitored the heating system and adjusted the airflow through the fire chamber. She answered questions from people who had never spoken to her before, and she did it with the same calm, steady manner she brought to everything. She did not seek attention. She did not accept praise. She simply kept the farm running the way she always had, one task at a time, one quiet hour after another. On the fourth evening, when the wind had finally begun to soften, and the first pale stars appeared through breaks in the clouds, Dot Pemberton stood near the center of the cave and asked for everyone's attention. The old woman's voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of being trusted. "There is something you all should know," Dot said. "Something I have kept to myself for a long time because I was asked to." The cave grew quiet. Lark, standing near the back wall, looked up but did not move. Dot continued. "After Lark lost her daughter, Wren, she left town. Most of you remember that. What you do not know is what she did after. Every winter since then, every single year, Lark has sent money to this town. Anonymously, no name, no return address, just cash in an envelope delivered to my store." Dot paused and let the silence do its work. "That money paid for winter coats for every child in the valley school. It paid for the new roof on the schoolhouse after the ice storm 3 years ago. It paid for firewood deliveries to 4 elderly households who could not afford their own." No one spoke. A few people turned to look at Lark, but she was staring at the floor, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw set in the hard line of someone who had never wanted this spoken aloud. "She asked me never to tell anyone," Dot said, "and I kept that promise until tonight. But I think you all deserve to know who has been taking care of this town while you were laughing at the woman in the cave." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people reconsidering everything they thought they knew. It was the silence of shame and gratitude arriving at the same moment and settling into the same space. Hank Dawson lowered his head and pressed his hat against his chest. Vince Cooley turned away and stared at the wall. Ruth Calloway wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Beckett Langford looked at Lark across the warm golden cave, and something passed between them that did not need words. Forgiveness. Recognition. The understanding that grief, when it does not destroy a person, can sometimes turn them into exactly what the world needs most. Later that night, after most of the families had settled into sleep along the warm bench and the stone floor, Lark sat alone near the back of the cave. Boone lay beside her, his head resting on her boot, his breathing slow and deep. The lamps had been dimmed. The only sound was the faint gurgle of water moving through the copper pipes and the occasional soft splash of a trout turning in its pond. Lark reached for the old wooden box she kept on the shelf beside the photographs. It had belonged to her father. The wood was scarred and dark with age, and the hinges protested quietly when she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of pine sap and wood smoke, lay a stack of hand-drawn papers. She had found these among Colt's belongings after he died. Blueprints drawn in pencil on yellowed paper in her father's careful, unschooled hand. Detailed sketches of a heating system built from clay and pipe. Diagrams of underground planting beds. Notes on water flow and ventilation and the thermal properties of packed earth. Colt Jessup had designed this cave farm years before Lark ever found the cave. He had drawn it up as a plan for a community shelter, a place where mountain families could ride out the worst winters together. He had envisioned a space exactly like the one his daughter had built, not for one person living alone, but for a whole valley, finding warmth in the same room. He had never gotten the chance to build it. His body had worn out before his ideas did. Lark had taken those drawings and made them real without ever knowing she was fulfilling someone else's dream. She had thought she was building a place to hide from her grief. She had thought she was atoning for the night she was not there. But looking at her father's careful pencil lines at the notes he had scribbled in the margins about community and shelter and taking care of neighbors who could not take care of themselves, she understood something she had missed for 3 years. She had not been hiding. She had been building exactly what Colt always wanted to exist. A place that held people when the cold tried to take them. A shelter built not for the person who made it, but for the people who would one day need it without knowing. Lark closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. She looked at the 2 photographs beside it. Wren smiling in her meadow of wildflowers, Colt standing in front of a timber frame with sawdust in his hair and quiet pride in his deep-set eyes. Then she looked across the cave, at the family sleeping on the warm bench her hands had built, at the children curled beneath blankets near the greenhouse, at Beckett Langford sitting against the far wall with his son asleep in his arms, at Hank and Vince and Ridley men who had laughed and doubted and looked away, now resting in the warmth of the very place they had mocked. Boone lifted his head and pressed his nose against Lark's hand. His amber eyes caught the lamplight and held it. 2 days later, the storm finally broke. The clouds pulled apart like torn fabric, and for the first time in nearly a week, sunlight fell across the Bitterroot Valley. The snow glittered so brightly it hurt to look at. Icicles hung from every roof and branch, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across the white ground. The world looked new, clean, as though the storm had scraped everything down to bare wood, and the valley was starting over. The townspeople began making their way back down the mountain, carrying blankets and tools, and a quietness that had not been there when they arrived. Several of them stopped at the cave entrance and looked back, not at the cave itself, but at the woman standing just inside it, one hand resting on her dog's broad head, the other hanging loose at her side. Before Beckett left, he walked over to Lark one last time. Cody stood beside him, the boy's small hand gripping his father's coat the same way it had on the night he was found. But Cody was smiling now. A wide, easy 7-year-old smile that lit up his entire freckled face. "Thank you," Beckett said. The words were simple, but the way he said them was not. They carried the weight of 2 rescues, one that had failed, one that had not. Lark nodded. Cody reached down and wrapped his arms around Boone's thick neck. The dog held perfectly still, his tail swaying once slowly before the boy let go and followed his father down the trail. In the weeks that followed, Lark began something she had never planned. She started teaching. Beckett came up the mountain first, then Hank, then a few others. She showed them how to build the earthen heating bench, how to lay the clay pipes, how to mix the soil for underground planting beds, and how to set up the gravity-fed water system using a natural spring. She taught the way her father had taught her, with patience, with repetition, with the understanding that knowledge only mattered if it was passed to someone who would use it. By early spring, 3 families in the valley had begun constructing their own versions of the heating system. The schoolhouse had a small indoor garden built by the students under Ruth Calloway's supervision using seeds from Lark's greenhouse. Vince Cooley, without ever being asked, had fabricated a set of copper pipe fittings designed specifically for the heating bench and left them at Dot's store with a note that said, "Simply for Lark's project." The cave remained, The farm continued to grow. Boone still patrolled the entrance each morning and lay beside the warm bench each night. But something had changed. One evening in late March, when the snow had begun to thin and the first stubborn blades of grass were pushing through the mud along the valley road, Lark placed a new photograph on the shelf beside Wren and Colt. It was a picture Dot had taken during the storm, when no one was paying attention. It showed Cody Langford sitting on the earthen bench, laughing with Boone's big head resting in his lap. The boy's eyes were bright. The dog's tail was a blur of motion. Behind them, barely visible in the lamplight, the green rows of the underground farm stretched toward the back of the cave like proof that something could still grow in the darkest places. Lark stood back and looked at the three photographs together. Her father, her daughter, and the boy her dog had carried home through the snow. She rested her hand on Boone's head. The dog leaned into her leg and exhaled slowly, the way he always did at the end of a long day, when the cave was quiet and the lamps burned low, and the world outside had finally stopped asking for anything. Dad and Wren would have liked that kid, Lark said softly. Boone's tail moved once against the stone floor. Outside the cave, the last light of the day was fading behind the Bitterroot Peaks. The sky had turned the color of bruised copper, streaked with thin bands of gold where the sun still touched the highest ridges. Somewhere below in the valley that had once laughed at the woman on the mountain, a few lights flickered on in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked in the distance and then was quiet. Spring was coming, and for the first time in 5 years, Lark Jessup did not dread it.